The Mets have just recently come off a disappointing season that resulted in the parting of ways with their manager and the hiring of Carlos Mendoza, the team's 24th manager in their history. If past is prologue, let's take a look at every Mets manager to see what to expect from the future tenure of Mendoza at the helm. Just a quick note, I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers, so if you like and subscribe, that would mean a lot. The Mets' first season was in 1962. Their first manager was the baseball lifer Casey Stengel. Born in 1890, he played in the majors for 14 seasons, winning 2 rings as a player with the Giants toward the end of his playing days before beginning his managerial career. At the age of 43, he became the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers for the 1934 season, the team he began his career with. After 3 years with the Dodgers, he spent time with the Boston Braves before taking the job he's most known for, that of the Yankees manager during their glory days of the 1950s. As manager of the Yankees, he led the team to 7 World Series titles and 10 league pennants. When the Mets were formed, they hired Stengel as a familiar face to lead the team, which ownership knew would be bad for many years. Stengel was 71 when he took the job, and he played the role of cheerleader for the new NL team in New York. But his years with championship-level talent saw his frustration boil over into famous quotes like, "Can anyone here play this game?" or "The only thing worse than a Mets game is a Mets doubleheader." The expansion Mets were a historically terrible team under Stengel, and they ended his 3+ year tenure with a record of 175 and 404. Obviously, they never made the playoffs during that time. After a hip injury at a party, Stengel decided to retire on August 30th, 1965. On September 2nd of that year, the Mets would retire his number 37. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1966, having had the 5-year waiting period after retirement waived for him. He never managed after his time with the Mets and died in 1975. He finished his managerial career with 1,905 wins and 1,842 losses, with 19 ties. His postseason record was 37-26 with 7 World Series titles and those 10 pennants. Upon Stengel's retirement, Mets pitching coach Wes Westburn was named interim manager for the rest of the 1965 season before taking the job full-time. Wes Westburn played 11 seasons in the majors, all for the New York Giants, winning 1 World Series as a player in 1954. After his playing career, he became a coach for the San Francisco Giants before joining the Mets for the 1964 season. He began as first base coach, before moving to the bullpen coach, and eventually the pitching coach. After only 11 days at the job, Casey Stengel announced his retirement, and Westburn was elevated to manager. Wes would lead the Mets out of the basement of the league for the first time in the 1966 season, finishing in 9th place. 1967 didn't see much improvement in the Mets, and Wes resigned with 11 days left in the 1967 season. He would finish his Mets managerial career with no postseason appearances and a record of 142 and 237. Wes would go on to manage the Giants for the 1974-75 seasons to a 111 and 129 record. Wes would end his managerial career with an overall record of 260 and 366, never seeing a postseason. Salty Parker, the Mets' third base coach, would take over managerial duties for the last 11 games of the 1967 season. Salty played in 1 major league season as a 23-year-old for the Tigers in 1936. He would appear in, ironically, only 11 games in his entire playing career before becoming a longtime minor league coach and manager. He coached for the Giants and Indians before his time as Mets manager resulted in a 4-7 record to end the 1967 season. After his time with the Mets, he would manage only 1 more major league game, this time for the expansion Astros in 1972, going 1-0. He ended his managerial career with a 5-7 record. After his time as Mets manager, he would continue to coach throughout the league for the Astros, where he would manage and win his only game, the Angels, the Giants, and finally the Mariners. Salty retired from the game in 1987. After the 1967 season, perhaps the most famous Mets manager, Gil Hodges, was announced to lead the team. Gil Hodges played for 18 seasons in the major leagues, missing 2 years early in his career to serve during World War II. Gil played for the famous Boys of Summer team of the Brooklyn Dodgers before following them to LA. He won 2 World Series as a player, 1 in Brooklyn and 1 in LA. Gil was brought on to play for the Mets at the end of his playing time, and played 2 seasons with the Mets, including their inaugural 1962 season. In 1963, he was traded to the Senators, where he became their manager, the Senators' 3rd manager that year. After the season, he was traded back to the Mets so he could retire as a Met, more in acknowledgement of his time with the Dodgers, an NL team of New York, when that meant something, than to acknowledge his time with the Mets. Gil immediately retired and then went back to Washington to be their manager. Gil managed the Senators for 5 seasons, never having a winning record. In 1968, he became the Mets' 4th manager. His hiring coincided with the development of the young Mets talent, as he would lead the famous Miracle Mets of '69 to their World Series victory. Gill would manage the team for 2 more seasons, winning 83 games each of those years. He would finish his tenure with the Mets with a 339 and 309 record, becoming the first Mets manager to finish their term with a winning record. At the young age of 47, as he was preparing for the 1968 season, Gill suffered a fatal heart attack. Gill would end up with a managerial record of 660 and 753 with 1 World Series title. With the sudden death of Hodges in April of 1968, the Mets tapped Yogi Berra to lead the team. Yogi Berra was the famous catcher of the Yankees for 18 of his 19 Major League seasons. His last playing season was in 1965 with the Mets, and the low-performing team was tapping familiar faces to fill the seats at Shea. Yogi won 10 World Series titles with the Yankees during his playing career before his retirement after the 1965 season. Berra originally retired after the 63 season, but was hired by the Yankees to be their manager for the 64 season. Berra would lead the Yankees to the World Series, losing in 7 games. He was fired as Yankees manager before unretiring to join the Mets as a player-coach for the 1965 season. Yogi appeared in only 4 games for the Mets as a player, but stayed on to coach through the 1971 season. With the sudden death of Gil Hodges, Yogi Berra was elevated to manager for the 1972 season. He would manage the team for 4 years, including 1 playoff appearance, as the Mets lost to the A's in 7-game series in the 1973 World Series. Berra would manage to a 292 and 296 regular season record for the Mets, and a 6-6 postseason record. Berra was fired as manager on August 5, 1975. The same year, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame as a catcher. He would be replaced by interim manager Roy McMillan. Berra would rejoin the Yankees as a coach after his time with the Mets. He would manage the Yankees for the 1984 and 85 seasons with a record of 93 and 85, lasting only 16 games into the 85 season. He finished his managerial career with a 484 and 444 winning record, with a 9-10 postseason record, including a pennant in each league. Roy McMillan would manage the team for the remainder of the 1975 season, going 26 and 27. Roy played in the majors primarily for the Reds in the 1950s. He spent time with the Braves in Milwaukee before closing out his playing career with 3 seasons as a Met. After his playing career, he joined the coaching staff in Milwaukee, this time for the Brewers. He would serve as interim manager there, going 1-1 in the 1972 season, before he was replaced. He would never manage again after his Mets tenure, finishing his managerial career with a 27 and 28 record. Though he is a member of the Reds Hall of Fame, following the 1975 season, the Mets would name Joe Frazier as their 5th full-time manager. Joe Frazier played in 4 Major League seasons, 1947 and then for the 54 through 56 seasons. An unremarkable player, Joe moved to manage in the minors for the Astros before joining the Mets organization in 1968. In his role as minor league manager, he would lead the Mets minor league affiliate Tidewater Mets to the International League Championship in 1975. Following his success in the minors, Frazier moved to the big club. He would see some success as the team improved to 86 wins for the 76 season. But after a poor start to the 1977 season, Joe was fired after 45 games. Frazier accumulated a 101 and 106 regular season record. Joe would return to managing in the minors, this time for the Cardinals organization. With the departure of Frazier, the Mets would again need a midseason replacement as manager. Frazier was replaced with a much more famous Joe, Joe Torre. Joe Torre was not the esteemed manager he is thought of today in 1977. Torre had an 18-year career in the majors, winning an MVP award with the Cardinals in 1971. He would finish his career as a Met, playing with the team for the 1975 through 77 seasons. At 36, Torre became a player-manager for the Mets, replacing Frazier. Appearing in only 26 games that year in the field, he would continue as their manager through the 1981 season. This was a poor time to lead the Mets. He would manage to a record of 286 and 420 during his tenure. The Mets never had a winning season with Torre at the helm. He was let go after the 81 season and replaced with George Bamberger. After departing the Mets, Torre would go on to manage the Braves for 3 seasons in the 80s and then 6 seasons in St. Louis in the early 90s. Torre would become the household name he is today the next year, as he became the Yankees manager beginning in 1996. This would be the first year of the Yankees dynasty, as Torre would lead the team to 4 World Series titles in 5 years and 6 AL pennants in his 12 years on the Bronx. After leaving the Yankees, he would manage the Dodgers for 3 seasons just before they became the dominant force in the National League. After leaving managing behind, Torre would take a job in the league offices. Torre would end up managing for 29 years, accumulating a winning percentage of .538 with 4 World Series rings. George Bamberger was hired to replace Torre for the 1982 season and would serve as the Mets manager for 2 years. Bamberger played in only 10 games over 3 seasons at the Major League level, though those 10 games spanned an entire decade. He made his debut in 1951 for the New York Giants and played his final game in 1959 for the Baltimore Orioles. Following the end of his major league days, he would play or manage in the Orioles minor league system in the early 60s. He would eventually become the pitching coach for the Orioles during their powerhouse days of the late 60s, early 70s. In 1978, he was given his first shot at managing in the majors by the Milwaukee Brewers, where he would manage for 2 seasons to a 188 and 135 record over the 1978 and 79 seasons. After a heart attack in 1980, he would manage the team for only 92 games. The Mets GM at the time was a former Orioles executive and hired Bamberger to manage the team in the middle of the long rebuild. He would finish his year-plus stint with an 81 and 127 record. After a poor start to the 83 season, Bamberger would resign on June 3rd. The Mets would replace Bamberger with another interim manager, Frank Howard. Bamberger would find his way back to Milwaukee for the 1985 season, rejoining the team as their manager for 2 seasons. He would end up winning 71 games in each of those years, and then hung it up for good with about a week left to the 1986 season. Bamberger's final stats as a big league manager were 458 and 478 over parts of 7 years. With the Mets still in rebuild mode, the interim manager for 1983, Frank Howard, would only serve that one season. He would finish with a 53 and 64 record. Frank had a 16-year major league career, mostly with the Dodgers and Senators. After he retired in 1973, he moved into a managerial position in the minors for the Brewers organization. Howard would coach for the Brewers during the Bamberger tenure in Milwaukee, before leaving to become the Padres manager for the 1981 season. He would manage the team for only that one season before joining the Mets as a coach for Bamberger. After Bamberger's departure, Howard would take the reins to complete the season. With the end of the season, the Mets would look to find a permanent replacement for the 1984 season. After leaving the Mets, Howard went on to coach for various teams through the 90s, including a return to the Mets from 1994 through 1996 as their hitting coach. He settled with the Yankees as a player development instructor until his final retirement after the 2008 season. For the 1984 season, the Mets were at the end of their rebuild and ready to compete. To lead their young core, they brought in perhaps the best-known Mets manager, Davey Johnson. Johnson would lead the team for 7 seasons and end up to hold the record for most games managed for the Mets for over 25 years. Johnson played in 13 major league seasons, most notably for the powerhouse Orioles of the 60s. He would win 2 rings with the O's and play in 4 World Series. His link to the Mets before his managing days was as the man who made the final out of the 1969 World Series against the Mets. After his retirement, Johnson would manage a season in the short-lived minor leagues called the Inter-American League. In 1981, Johnson was brought into the Mets organization as a minor league manager, where he would manage for the AA and AAA affiliates through 1983. In 1984, he would be called up to take the role as the manager for the big club. Johnson would of course be the manager for the World Series winning 1986 team. He would finish his 7-year tenure with a record of .595 and .467, becoming only the second Mets manager to finish a career with a winning record, and became the first Mets manager to manage over 1,000 games, finishing with 1,012 games managed. After a poor start to the 1990 season and some tension with the Mets GM, Johnson was fired just 42 games into the 1990 season. He would finish with 1 World Series ring and an 11-9 postseason record. Even though his total games managed mark for the Mets would eventually be passed, his 595 wins still stands as the high water mark for all-time Mets managers. He was inducted into the Mets Hall of Fame in 2010. After leaving the Mets, Johnson would go on to manage the Reds for 3 seasons, the Orioles for 2, including a Manager of the Year award in 1997, leading the team to 98 wins, and the Dodgers for 2 to close out the 90s. His last stint as manager came as the National skipper for 2+ seasons ending in 2013. He would again win Manager of the Year, this time in 2012, as the 98-win Nationals team would make the postseason for their first time in Washington. Johnson would end up managing for 17 seasons, going 1,372 and 1,071, with a postseason record of 25 and 26, having made the postseason 6 times, winning 1 pennant and 1 World Series. To replace Johnson, the 1969 fan favorite Buddy Harrelson took over to close out the 1990 season, and would continue through the 1991 season. Like I said, Harrelson was a fan favorite second baseman on the 1969 World Series winning team. He played 16 Major League seasons, 13 of them with the Mets. He played in 2 playoffs and won 1 World Series ring. After retiring in 1980, Bud was hired by the Mets as a minor league coach. He would be elevated to the big club when third base coach Bobby Valentine took the managerial job with the Rangers during the 1985 season. Harrelson would continue as Mets coach until he replaced Davey Johnson as the manager during the 1990 season. The Mets would finish with 91 wins that year, and he would be brought on as permanent manager for the 91 season. With the team's second half collapse, Bud was fired with about a week left in the season, being replaced with Mike Cubbage. Harrelson would never again manage or coach in the big leagues, but did end up owning his hometown Long Island Ducks, an unaffiliated minor league team in the suburbs of New York City. Harrison would end his managerial career with no postseason appearances and a 149 and 125 record. Mike Cubbage, the man who replaced Harrison with a week to go in the 1991 season, would not lose his interim title and only manage those 7 games, going 3-4 to end the season. Cubbage had an 8-year major league career with the Rangers and Twins, ending his playing days in 1980 with the Mets. Cubbage never saw the postseason in his playing career. After retirement, he became a minor league manager for the Mets beginning in 1983, managing at every level. Cubbage became the Mets' third base coach in 1990 before taking on this interim title role to close out the 91 season. He would never manage in the bigs again after leaving the Mets. Cubbage would serve several roles for the Red Sox organization, even seeing an interim manager position during a spring training game in 2002. As the Mets' great teams of the 80s was breaking up, the Mets moved to hire a veteran big league manager, Jeff Torborg, to lead the team. Jeff Torborg began playing in the majors in 1964 and would play in the majors for 10 seasons, all in California for the Dodgers and Angels. He never made the playoffs and retired after the 1973 season. Torborg began his managerial career in 1977 for the then-named Cleveland Indians. He managed the team for 3 seasons before being let go during the 1979 season. He immediately picked up with the Yankees, serving as a coach through the 1988 season. In 1989, he became the manager of the White Sox and led them through 2 winning seasons out of the 3 years he was there, winning the American League Manager of the Year in 1989. In 1992, he was hired by the Mets to be their 10th full-time manager. This was the fabled worst team money could buy team. Torborg would spend only 2 seasons with the Mets, going 85 and 115 during his 200-game run as manager. He wouldn't reach the playoffs with the Mets, and was fired 39 games into the 1993 season after a 13 and 25 record. After leaving the Mets, Torborg moved into the broadcast booth for the rest of the century, even doing color commentary for 3 World Series. Jeff would return to the dugout in 2001, leading the Expos for a season, and followed the ownership to Florida after an expensive game of musical chairs. He led the Marlins for part of 2 seasons, being fired 38 games into the team's 2003 championship run. After leaving managing behind for good, Torborg went back to the booth to close out his professional career. During the disastrous Torborg era, the Mets turned to another season's manager, Dallas Green, as their mid-season replacement. Dallas Green would lead the Mets until the end of the 1996 season. Dallas would end up with no postseason appearances and a record of 229 and 283. Green had an 8-year major league career, mainly for the Phillies, but he did spend the 1966 season with the Mets towards the end of his career. He never made the postseason as a player. After his retirement in 1967, Green would immediately move into a position as minor league manager for the Phillies. He would hold various positions throughout the organization through the 70s. In 1979, he was given the job of manager of the Phillies. He would spend part of 3 seasons in that role, leading the club into the postseason twice, and winning it all in 1980. After the 81 season, Green left Philly to become the GM of the Cubs. As Cubs GM, he would lead the charge to install lights at Wrigley. In 1989, he returned to the dugout as manager of the Yankees. He lasted only 121 games and was fired after completing only part of 1 season. Green joined the Mets organization in 1991 as a scout and ascended to the position of manager in 1993. The Mets were rebuilding at the time, and Dallas found little success with the club. After his departure from the Mets, with about a month left in the 1996 season, Green returned to the Phillies, where he would serve various roles for the rest of his professional life. Dallas would complete his 8-year managerial career with a 454 and 478 record, having gone to the playoffs twice and winning 1 World Series. To replace Green to close out the 1996 season, one of the most outspoken Mets managers was tapped to take on the job, Bobby Valentine. Valentine had a 10-year Major League journeyman career, playing for the Mets for 2 seasons in the 70s before retiring after the 1979 season. Valentine never made the playoffs as a player. After his playing career, Valentine joined the Mets organization as a coach before leaving to become manager for the Texas Rangers early into the 1985 season. He stayed with the Rangers for part of 8 seasons, until being fired during the 1992 season. He finished his time with the Rangers with a 581 and 605 record, finishing second in the Manager of the Year voting for the 1986 season. The Rangers never made the playoffs under Valentine. After his departure, he returned to the Mets to manage their AAA affiliate for the 94 season. Valentine took on a new challenge for the 1995 season as he moved to Japan to manage for a year. He was fired after only 1 season despite having a winning record. He came back to manage the Tides once again for the 96 season and was promoted to the Mets manager with a month left in the season. Valentine led the Mets to the playoffs twice and to the 2000 World Series, the only pennant of his career. Valentine would go on to have a regular season record of .536 and .467 over his 7 seasons with the Mets. He also posted a playoff record of 13-11. He was the first manager to lead the Mets to 2 consecutive playoff appearances, but his brash style combined with the slumping team led to his departure after the 2002 season. Valentine would return to manage in Japan after his time with the Mets. He would go on to lead his team, the Chiba Lotta Marines, to their first Japan Series win since 1974. After his firing in Japan due to conflict with the front office, Valentine would take a job with ESPN. He would stay with the network until he took over the Boston Red Sox for the 2012 season. Valentine lasted only 1 season in Boston, as his managerial style clashed with the players, and the season ended in the worst of his career, and one of Boston's worst records of the 21st century. After his departure from the MLB, Valentine returned to his home state of Connecticut to become athletic director of Sacred Heart University. Valentine has pursued other interests outside of baseball in the ensuing years, but will still occasionally be seen as a guest commentator on post-game Met broadcasts. Valentine finished his 16-year managerial career with 1,186 wins against 1,165 losses, with his only postseason coming in his 2 runs for the Mets. Following the 2002 season, Valentine was let go, and the Mets would reach out to hire Art Howe from the A's. The Moneyball A's had made known that they were willing to part ways with Howe despite his on-field success. This was in the days before the book Moneyball had exposed the inner workings of the A's that season. Art Howe had an 11-year major league career, playing primarily for the Houston Astros. He appeared in the playoffs 3 times in his playing career, but never made it to a World Series. After his retirement in 1985, he joined the Texas Rangers as part of the coaching staff under Bobby Valentine. After a 3-year stint in Houston, he was tapped for his first shot at a big league managerial position with the Houston Astros. Howe managed the Astros for 5 years, before they became a powerhouse in the late 90s. He was fired and replaced with Terry Collins. After his departure from the Astros, Art became a scout for the Angels, then spent a season as bench coach for the Rockies. Howe was brought into Oakland for the 1996 season to replace longtime manager Tony La Russa. Art would spend 7 seasons in Oakland, and after a few seasons of growing pains, he led them through their early Moneyball success, including 2 100-plus win seasons and 3 playoff appearances. He would post a 6-9 postseason record, having lost 3 consecutive ALDS Game 5s. While not fired from the A's, the Mets were only able to hire him because the A's wanted to move on and replace him with a more Moneyball-friendly bench coach, Ken Maka. Art would lead the Mets through the 2003 and 2004 seasons to a record of 137 and 186. After the 2004 season, Art was let go. After his time with the Mets, he would never again manage. He would go on to coach in the Phillies and Rangers organizations. Howe finished his 14-year managerial career with 1,129 wins and 1,137 losses, having appeared in the playoffs only the 3 times he went with Oakland. At the conclusion of the 2004 season, the Mets would hire their 14th full-time manager, Yankees bench coach Willie Randolph. Willie Randolph had an 18-year playing career primarily for the Yankees, though he did play his last season in the Bigs with the Mets in 1992. After he retired, he took a coaching job with the Yankees. He served various roles with the Yankees for 11 seasons until being hired by the Mets for the 2005 season. Willie took over the Mets just as they were coming out of a rebuild and led the team to the playoffs in 2006. The team would win 97 games that season but get bounced from the playoffs in the NLCS. Randolph would continue to manage the Mets until being fired in 2008 unceremoniously after deboarding a plane to begin a West Coast trip. Randolph saw success, but was also manager for one of the worst late-season collapses in baseball history during the 2007 season. Randolph would never manage again in the majors. He would finish his time with the Mets with a 302 and 253 record and a postseason record of 6-4. His .544 winning percentage as manager of the Mets ranked second all-time for the team. Randolph would go on to become the Brewers bench coach after leaving the Mets. He would then join Buck Showalter's staff in Baltimore as his bench coach for the 2011 season. He has gone on to coach and manage for Team USA at various levels, including the World Baseball Classic in 2012. In 2015, Randolph was honored with a plaque at Yankee Stadium's Monument Park. As the Mets were his only managerial job, his record with the Mets represents his entire managerial career and numbers. With the Mets trying to unsuccessfully avoid a second consecutive late-season collapse, the fired Willie Randolph would be replaced with his bench coach, Jerry Manuel. Jerry played in only part of 5 big league seasons during his career, but did reach the postseason once with the Expos in 1981. After his retirement in 1982, Jerry began to scout for the White Sox. He would spend the next decade with the Expos organization as a minor league coach until being given his first managerial position with the Expos minor league AA affiliate, where he won Manager of the Year. He would then move to the AAA team and finally get back to the majors as the Expos' third base coach during the 1991 season. In 1997, he joined Jim Leyland's staff as the bench coach in Florida, where he'd be part of the World Series winning team. The following year, Jerry would finally get his chance to manage at the big league level, having been hired by the Chicago White Sox. He would manage the team for 6 seasons until 2003, and depart only 2 years before they would win the World Series in 2005. He would manage the team during the 2000 playoff appearance and win Manager of the Year. After his time with the White Sox, he would join the Mets as a coach under Willie Randolph for the 2005 season. In 2006, he became the bench coach and held that position until he was elevated to manager after the firing of Randolph during the 2008 season. As stated, Manuel would not prevent the late season collapse of the Mets of 2008, but he would remain the team's manager through the 2010 season. Jerry would end his Mets tenure with a record of 204 and 213 while never reaching the playoffs with the Mets. Jerry's contract was not extended after the 2010 season, and he left professional baseball behind. Jerry would go on to become director of baseball operations for William Jessup University in California and bench coach for Team USA during the 2023 World Baseball Classic. Jerry would finish his 9-year managerial career with 704 wins and 684 losses. His postseason record was a disappointing 0-3, as he reached the postseason only once and was swept by the Mariners while managing the White Sox in the year 2000. After the 2010 season, the Mets would hire what would become their current longest-serving manager of their organizational history, Terry Collins. Collins would be the first Mets manager without any big league experience, though he did play 10 years in the minors for the Pirates and Dodgers. After retiring from playing, Terry would become a minor league manager in the Dodgers organization, beginning in Class A. He would move up to AAA as their manager until moving to the Pirates organization to manage their AAA affiliate in Buffalo. In 1992, Collins finally made it to the big leagues as the Pirates bullpen coach for the 1992 season. He would stay in that role through the 1993 season, before being given a shot as the manager of the Houston Astros, replacing the just-fired Art Howe. Collins would see success with the Astros, posting a winning record in each of his 3 seasons, but missed the playoffs every year. After being let go by Houston, Collins landed the managerial job for the Anaheim Angels for the 1997 season. He would manage the team for part of 3 seasons, posting a winning record for his first 2, but a disappointing 1999 campaign and a player revolt led to Collins resigning with a month left in the season. After some time away from the game, Collins would pick up in Japan, managing there for 2 seasons and then managing the Chinese national team for the 2009 World Baseball Classic. Collins would first join the Mets organization in 2010 as their minor league field coordinator. At the end of that season, he would be hired to lead the Mets beginning in 2011. Collins would manage the Mets for 7 seasons and reach the postseason twice, becoming only the second Mets manager to make back-to-back postseason appearances. Collins would lead the Mets to win the NL pennant in 2015 but fall short of the World Series title. After the 2017 season, Collins retired. He finished his 7-year Mets tenure with a regular season record of 551 and 583. His 1,134 games remains the high water mark for games managed by a Mets manager. His postseason record of 8-6 would encompass his only 2 postseason appearances. After retirement, Collins would stay with the organization as a special assistant to the GM and join the broadcast team at SNY, the Mets network, as an analyst. To replace the long-serving manager, the Mets would pull from outside their organization. On October 23, 2017, Mickey Callaway would be announced as the Mets' 17th full-time manager. Callaway had a subpar 5-year Major League career, mainly pitching in the AL West. He was a member of the 2002 World Series winning Anaheim Angels team, but never appeared in the postseason. After the 2004 season, his MLB playing days were over, and he took his talents to Japan, where he spent 2 years as an all-star. Callaway ended his playing career with a stint in China. In 2013, Callaway moved on to coaching, where he was brought on as the Indians pitching coach. Callaway's staff would drive the Indians all the way to the league pennant in 2016, where the Indians manager Terry Francona would give much credit to Callaway for their World Series run. When Callaway was named manager of the Mets, it was hoped that he could help the Mets' young pitching staff, especially Matt Harvey, who was struggling to recover from arm problems. Callaway's Mets career got off to a hot start in 2018, as the team began 11-1, but would win only 66 more games the rest of the season. After a third-place non-postseason 2019, Callaway was fired in October. He would finish his Mets managerial career with a 161 record and no postseason appearances. After leaving the Mets, controversy struck Callaway, as he was accused of sexual misconduct. The MLB would eventually place him on an ineligible list for his violations. He would coach and manage in Mexico, but was eventually let go from those positions as well. He is currently a real estate agent and out of baseball completely. Mickey's short and tumultuous tenure with the Mets was over, and a new manager would need to be hired. This time the Mets would look inward and elevate Luis Rojas. Luis Rojas never played Major League Baseball, but certainly had Major League pedigree, as the son of former Major League player and manager Felipe Alou. Luis played in the minors, but injuries stunted his growth and he never made it to the big leagues. By 2006, Luis shifted his focus to coaching when he began coaching in the Dominican Winter League for the Mets. He would then move to the minor leagues proper for the Mets in the Gulf Coast League, where he would win Manager of the Year. He rose to as high as Double-A before becoming a coach at the Major League level. Rojas was named manager of the Mets on January 22, 2020, after the hiring and subsequent parting of ways with Carlos Beltran, who had been named manager of the Mets before the Astros cheating scandal broke. Once his involvement became known, he and the Mets would part ways to avoid distractions. Rojas, the respected minor league manager, would now take his place. As manager, the Mets would underperform. Not helped by the calamity that was the 2020 season, Rojas' team played to a 103 and 119 record over his 2 seasons. The Mets declined Rojas' option for the 2022 season after the team had spent the most time in first place of any team in baseball history to eventually finish with a losing record and miss the playoffs. Rojas' departure marked not only the end of his time as manager, but a shift in the entire organization as the team was sold to Steve Cohen and his front office would choose the team's next manager. Rojas would go on to serve as Yankees third base coach after leaving the Mets and remains with that organization today. To replace the first-time manager Rojas, the Mets would bring in one of the most tenured managers in baseball, Buck Showalter. Buck never played in the majors, only having a short minor league career with the Yankees organization. By 1985, he had shifted to coaching and managing, being brought on to manage the Yankees' single-A affiliate in upstate New York. Within 2 years, he had moved up the ranks and was named Minor League Manager of the Year by Baseball America in 1987. In 1990, he joined the big club as part of their coaching staff and moved into the managerial position for the 1992 season. He would spend 4 seasons as the Yankees manager, being let go after the postseason loss to the Mariners in the 1995 ALDS. The Yankees would go on to win the World Series the very next year. Showalter was then tapped to lead the newly formed Arizona Diamondbacks. He would spend only 3 seasons there. He would again be bounced from the playoffs in the division series, the one year they made it to the playoffs. The Diamondbacks would go on to win the World Series the year after Showalter's departure. He would then become an analyst for ESPN before spending 4 seasons as manager of the Rangers. Those Rangers teams would never make the playoffs. He would then join the Indians organization and return to ESPN before being tapped to take over the Orioles midway through the 2010 season. Buck would spend 9 years in Baltimore, making 3 postseason appearances. Twice, the O's would make it to and lost in the championship series, and his final appearance with the team resulted in a one-and-done wildcard loss. After his time with the O's, Buck returned to ESPN before being hired to lead the Mets into the 2022 season. His high-priced team would win 101 games but faltered at the end to lose the division and get bounced in the wildcard round. Buck's second season with the Mets was one of the team's biggest disasters as the highest payroll in baseball history resulted in a losing record and a sell-off of assets at the trade deadline. Buck was allowed to finish the season but released from his contract at the conclusion of the last game. Buck would finish his Mets career as manager with a 175 and 148 record, with 1 playoff appearance going 1-3. His full managerial career has spanned 22 seasons, leading his teams to an overall 1,727 wins against 1,665 losses, with 6 playoff appearances but no World Series wins or appearances. Carlos Mendoza becomes the Mets' 20th full-time manager. Mendoza, like Collins and Showalter before him, never played Major League Baseball, but he did have a 13-year minor league career before moving into coaching. Beginning in 2009, he became a manager and a coach within the Yankees organization. He became the bench coach of the Yankees for the 2020 season, a position he held until being hired by the Mets to be their manager for the upcoming season. So there it is, every Mets manager. What can we learn from this? Absolutely nothing. The Mets have had 4 managers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 6 in the 90s, 4 again in the aughts, 3 in the 2010s, and are now already on their 3rd manager of the 2020s. Mets managers generally have short terms and don't make the playoffs, but you never know. Is losing Buck the sign that this team is ready to make a World Series run, or will Mendoza be just another in a long list of forgotten managers that leave with a losing record? We'll have to wait and see. What are your thoughts? Who is your favorite manager? Which do you think got fired before their time, or were given too much of a leash? Leave it in the comments. With that, I ask for a like and subscribe, or leave a comment, let me know what you thought, and as always, let's go Mets.